Welcome to our podcast today, Civil Rights in a Hostile World. I'm Karina Robinson from the LSE's The Inclusion Initiative, an institute dedicated to increasing diversity and inclusion at work through data and behavioral science. Our guests today are two individuals who are not afraid to raise their heads above the parapet. So Trevor Phillips and Iain Anderson. Let me keep their introductions as short as one can, given their distinguished careers. Trevor is a well-known anti-racism campaigner, writer, TV producer, co-founder of Weber Phillips, Times columnist, and chairman of the global Freedom of Expression campaign charity Index on Censorship, senior fellow at the Policy Exchange think tank, and founding chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Iain Anderson is a well-known LGBT plus campaigner, has over 25 years experience in communications, co-founder and executive chairman at Cicero Group, NED at Innovate Finance. In September 2021, he was appointed by the UK government LGBT plus business champion, a role from which he resigned not that much later, and we're going to be talking about that. He's also the incoming chair of Stonewall. Now, what are we going to be talking about? The rolling back of individual rights from Roe versus Wade to the cancellation of the UK's Safe to Be Me summit, what the US midterms mean for protected groups, and we've had some very surprising results from the US, to a billionaire's takeover of the world's town hall. Now, Trevor, will you start us off a few minutes on how you see the world at this time? Sorry, could somebody unmute Trevor Phillips?
I beg your pardon. I thought it was telling me that I had been unmuted. Forgive me. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for that, that simple challenge. Would you describe the state of the world in 90 seconds, please? I think that the simplest way to describe the way I see this is that when I used to be in proper journalism rather than the hobby journalism I do now, Times and Sky News, I used to say that there'd be two big challenges for the world in the 21st century. One would be how we lived with the planet. The other is how we live with each other. Actually, what I've learned in the last 20 years is that those challenges, though they look separate and to some extent often are separate, they are very much interlinked. And we're seeing at COP right now, for example, in Egypt, the argument that's taking place between what I guess I'd describe as the West and the rest, which is about who has the greater responsibility right now for taking steps to reach net zero. Of course, it is reasonable for much of the West to say that everybody has a responsibility here, and China and India in particular, who are huge emitters of greenhouse gases. But on the other hand, it's also reasonable for developing nations to say, look, you lot, you had 2 centuries of despoiling the planet, and now you come to us after 2 centuries of telling us what we cannot do, and say that now we've got our foot on the bottom rung of the development ladder, we're not allowed to do what you did, which is to take our people out of poverty, to create development, to innovate, and so on, the way that you did. So these two things are very much interlinked. So I say how we live with our planet and how we live with each other. But I guess much of our session today is really about the latter. And I think there's 3 things that I would look at when I worry about these issues of diversity and inclusion, how we manage relations between humans and groups of humans. First of all, we're going through a massive revolution, what people talk about as the 4th Industrial Revolution, the digital revolution, where all sorts of things are changing. I think about this really in the same way as coming of the railways 2 centuries ago, when at the time, nobody really understood what was going to happen. For many years they thought, oh, well, this is just going to help us move livestock from one part of the world country to another. Nobody imagined that railways would completely reshape our physical geography, actually reshape our clocks even. Small things, huge things that changed our culture. I think we're still in the foothills of understanding what digital tech will do to us. But very practically, in the next year or two, one of the things that I did in recent times was to be president of a big retailer in the UK, John Lewis. And one of the things that's absolutely clear for anybody who's in retail is that the 4 or 5 million people who work in that industry right now, in the next half a decade, we're probably going to lose 1 million of those. Those job losses will not be distributed evenly across the population. Women, 75% of the 80,000 or so people who work at John Lewis and Waitrose, female, women will be less likely to be employed. Ditto logistics, not logistics, but transport, where that industry is something like 80 or 90% male, but it's going to lose, again, the best part of 1 million jobs in the next half decade. My point here, and amongst those men, by the way, ethnic minorities are disproportionately represented. My point here is digital technology will have an asymmetric impact. The second big thing will be demographics at home and abroad. We all know we're an aging society. 85%, the proportion of our population who are over 85, and that, by the way, will include people like me, will double in the next couple of decades. And that's going to change all sorts of things about our society. But alongside that, we see the population explosion in the Middle East and Africa. And, we can have political arguments about the nature of migration and whether the current Home Office is doing its job well or not. But the big picture is that is not going to be stopped. The two things go together. We're an aging population that will need young workers, and they will turn up here and they will be different. And we will need, as a society, to understand those differences. There's a third big thing, which is China, but I don't want to spend any time on that. But lastly, I just want to make one big point about something that we, in our work, and when I say we in this case, I'm talking partly about the data analytics company I set up at Trevor Phillips, but also the recruitment company that I chair, Green Park, where we put 400 or 500 people a year in top jobs, board -1, board -2. And we spend a lot of time thinking about the labour market. Everybody knows that the UK labour market is only going to become tighter in the next decade. It will be solved, the problems that we face will be solved to some extent by greater migration. And, though there's a lot of noise about this, the truth is, again, everybody knows what's going to happen. What we are not is prepared for it, because those who come to join us will have different ways of looking at the world. They will require different things in the workplace. This is a very big issue. It is probably the single biggest issue for most businesses who are limited in their growth by the ability to recruit staff. But they will only recruit staff preferentially to, let's say, France or Germany, if we can demonstrate that we are a welcoming home. And that means some very practical things, which I think will create substantial frictions in our society. But that's not just a matter of employment. We're seeing the potential for friction between different cultures and different nations. And if I just mention two issues very much in headlines right now. Let us not kid ourselves. We have a view, which is a mainstream view, one I agree with, about the position of LGBTQ people, which essentially tells us that what we are going to be confronted with in Qatar during the World Cup is not nice. It's not good. It's not really where we should be. But let's not kid ourselves. Most Qataris are probably on the other side of this. There are actually clearly differences of views. I've worked as chair of Index on Censorship to publish work by Russian authors and Ukrainian authors, given the situation there, which are, in the Russian case, forbidden works, suppressed works. And I think we need to be clear here too, though most of us in this country have a similar view about supporting Ukraine. I'm myself absolutely 100% committed, but we should not kid ourselves. 75 to 80% of Russians think that Putin is right. The reason I'm making these points is going back to my first point, which is living with each other is not going to become simpler, and we're not going to solve it simply by sloganizing. We are in a world where there is a conflict about the way that we should live, what is fair, how we live with each other. And that's why the issues of diversity, the issues of inclusion are really huge ones and really, really more significant than I think we sometimes give them credit for.
Thank you, Trevor, for that tour de force. And definitely right, diversity inclusion is not just, a little thing that lives in an office at the end of the corridor. It's crucial to our society and to our companies and to how we will run our societies. Now, Iain, could we have your view of the state of the world?
Thank you, Karina. And listening to Trevor there, normally I would be sitting in London, but today I'm actually sitting in Washington, DC. And I think, as you were saying up front, into this conversation, sitting in the aftermath of a somewhat unexpected result to these US midterm elections. A set of results so far, and of course, given the American electoral process, we're still to see what the eventual outcome looks like. But on the turf that's perhaps most relevant for today, in terms of civil rights, in terms of social progress, I'm kind of reminded of something that Barack Obama once said, which is America makes progress, but it doesn't necessarily do so in a straight line. Yeah, and a lot of people had kind of dismissed whether or not some of those polls on the Roe v. Wade question would have any impact whatsoever on these midterms. And last night I spent a bit of time both with Republican and Democratic strategists here in DC, and both the Republicans a little bit more privately, the Democrats a little bit more noisily, said that actually what has happened in several states is that the debate around social progress, the debate around an issue such as Roe v. Wade, has layered all the way over these elections. It's held back in many states the prospect of a red wave, and the concept of a red ripple is there. What it's also done here is it's rather mixed up and mashed up the inevitability of Trump in 2024. He now has a real challenger in DeSantis. Of course, he has a real challenger in DeSantis playing very, very, very similar notes about a woke war, quote unquote. We can all debate what a woke war looks like for many of us. But for me, I'm actually in a lot of agreement with Trevor around the impact of digital in this conversation. And my day job, beyond being the incoming chair of Stonewall and the work I do with the university sector as well, but my day job is running a communications business, Cicero. And we constantly grope around, and I've used that term deliberately, as to what is an effective digital communication strategy for organizations, public and private. And when people say they have a digital strategy, they portray to be terribly confident about what that approach is. I think that's all completely illusory, because the conversation that is ongoing right now is not actually a conversation a lot of the time. It's a shouting match. People are screaming at each other in these social spaces. Again, as part of our conversation, in the run up to our conversation, I'm thinking a lot, I think many of us are, about what will Elon Musk's next move be with probably the biggest social square in terms of a lot of our conversation, public policy conversation, at least, not the wider interpersonal conversation. And that is, what does he do next with Twitter? There are some people who are already cancelling themselves off Twitter before they've worked out exactly what he's going to do with Twitter, before he's worked out himself what he's going to do with Twitter. So for me, we've got to think as human beings about ways to try and have a conversation again, and not a screaming and a shouting match. Because all we've got right now is noise and fury from either elites or the kind of people that, when I was a full-time journalist, you used to call the Green Ink Brigade. Now, some of you listening in might know what I mean when I talk about the Green Ink Brigade. When I was a cub reporter, a editor used to say to me, and this is well before the days of digital, you're going to get lots of green ink on that one, Iain. And I used to say, what on earth do you mean? And he said, well, you're going to have a lot of crazy people who are going to write to you. And do you know what I do with it? I take it and I put it straight in the bin. The problem with the public square at the minute, is people are not putting it in the bin. They're responding to it. They're baited by it. And the whole thing, if you watch some of this, just gets more and more crazy. So look, the first thing for me is that we need to try and find ways and think about ways and focus on ways to have a more respectful conversation in this digital era. The second thing for me is that too often the conversation about diversity and inclusion does not include a wider conversation about social mobility. Yeah. So when I was briefly, as you kindly reminded me, having my adventure, and I think that's the best way of putting it, of working with government as the first ever UK LGBT business champion, I deliberately sought out sectors of the economy where this conversation about allowing people to be themselves at work, whoever they are, doesn't normally take place. Yeah, so, there's a very comfortable conversation for a lot of people who live in zone 1 of our metropolitan centres. But is it going on with oil and gas? Is it going on with automotive? Is it going on actually in parts of retail that are not the sort of high-end luxury parts of retail? So what I wanted to try and do was to start that conversation in a way and think about policies and think about progress in a way that for me is about meaningful social progress, so that people in all parts of society, up and down geographically, up and down in terms of the social spectrum, can see that progress is actually taking place, as opposed to this kind of rather rarefied conversation about people that's taking place, or what people should be thinking about. We need to include people in that at all levels in that conversation, and I don't think that's necessarily happening. But my final point, and this is the sort of reason for hope for me, is not just, again, the sort of sat here in America and in the immediate aftermath of these midterms, that, if you look in Kansas, you look in Kentucky, you look in Michigan, you look in North Carolina, you look in Pennsylvania, a lot of people have voted for continued social progress. And that gives me a reason for hope. When I resigned as LGBT business champion, a lot of businesses, large and small, said, actually, we think you're doing the right thing by stepping back, and we want to try and support you. And I actually think an awful lot of businesses, large and small, are way ahead of policymakers because they're ignoring the noise. And the final point is looking at the numbers. There's a very interesting think tank in the UK called More in Common. I'm sure many online are aware of the work of Luke Tyrrell and his team. And when it comes to the thing that I'm most known for, I think, in this public square, and that is LGBTQ rights, 84% of people are in a live and let live, let's see progress, do no harm, be respectful, let's see opportunity place. Now, that does mean, of course, 17% of people are not. Although I actually don't think it's 17%, I think it's maybe closer to 10, 12% of any population. But that 10, 12% in this digital world are noisier than they've ever been, and they're skewing the ability for us to come together.
But Iain, that makes absolute sense, because the moderates are never going to be on the streets. The moderates are never going to be trolling people. So, I mean, as you say, you talked about Elon Musk, and he always says free speech versus political correctness. Well, it seems to me, and Trevor, just give me an idea about this. How do we balance that need for free speech while avoiding racism, homophobia, misogyny, and hate? Because I'm not sure there is a solution to this. And we will continue to amplify those extreme voices.
Yeah, I mean, point one, and this isn't, an obvious thing to say, which I know and probably most people on this call know, Twitter's not really the world. I mean, we just need to step back and grasp that that particular platform, but it's true about other platforms, they're like going to the theatre. It's not where most people live. It tells you some interesting things, as sometimes going to the theatre or cinema does, but getting wound up about it as though it's real is, I think, wrong. And by the way, that's not to say it doesn't matter or it doesn't have significance. That people who have been to see great movies that, for example, I'm just off the top of my head, for many people for whom the Second World War is really quite ancient history, and the Nazis are a bit of a kind of dressing up villain joke. If you went to see, I don't know, Cabaret or Schindler's List, these things will have changed your thinking about the world. Now, none of that means this is the true picture. So first point about all of that, I think we need to be a bit careful about sort of inhabiting the world, the world of Twitter, as though, frankly, it matters more than it does. The second thing is, I am, to be frank, and I'm sure this will come up in some of the other things we'll talk about, a freedom of speech absolutist, which doesn't mean entirely that I think anybody can say anything they like. The distinction I think I tend to make is that somebody may stand on the other side of the street and call me names. They may call me the N-word and so on. And in my book, that's lawful. It's not fine, but in my book, from my family's point of view, that tells me more about them than it tells me anything to do with me. And as far as I'm concerned, they have the right to do that. And in some ways, as a Black person, to be honest, I would rather know what somebody really thinks of me than have them smile but call me the N word in their heads. But I think that the issue here, so that what I'm really saying is that I'm not sure I think there is a balance of rights. There is a first right, which is the right for people to think what they want to think and to say what they want to say. What they can't do is stand on the other side of the road and say to their friends, let's go and get the N word, because that's a different thing. That's a call to action. But frankly, in the end, we just have to live with the fact that people think what they think, they say what they say, and what we can do practically, for example, with our children, is help to give them resilience. And I will simply say, I come from a very big family. I'm the 10th of 10 children, and therefore we are a big tribe, which most of which, by the way, lives in North America now. But we give all our children very early on what we would call the talk about what it's like to be Black, what you have to deal with, what's important about it, and what is not important about it. And a big part of that talk is to remind them that what is important about their lives is not what somebody who hates them because they're a bit bonkers thinks. What matters is what they think about themselves, what those who are close to them and love them think about them, and what they do with their lives.
Thank you, Trevor. Very interesting, because actually I think very few people would say what you have just said, which is absolutely fascinating. I want to move Iain to something else.
Can I
yes, absolutely.
Just briefly pick up on that we don't teach resilience. We don't teach resilience. If we did, I would be an awful lot more comfortable with the ability to have some of these robust conversations. And I think the problem at the minute, and this is back to some of the obsessing about Twitter stuff, is that a lot of the conversation is now being tipped from being robust into sometimes moving into a hateful and sometimes then a more personally violent place. So I actually think that we need an awful lot more in curricula. We need an awful lot more in terms of what we do to support young people to make them more resilient.
And how does the geopolitical rise of China fit into this? Because it used to be America, whatever its faults, Statue of Liberty, free speech, pluralistic, but we now have the geopolitical rise of China affecting civil rights, a country that subsumes individual rights to what the state thinks best, sells its monitoring machines to regimes that use it to suppress dissent. It's a different model, and people are going to have to choose between the US and China. And one thing Trevor pointed out that was very interesting, which is, sort of living here in London, you see, of course, you'd support Ukraine because the Russians invaded. But actually, most of the rest of the world, over around 70%, I think you said, is not supporting those sanctions, does not see it in the same way. So there are other models now. Iain?
Yeah, there are. And, I think sort of we in the West, if I can put it that way, have to reflect back on the last 20, 30 years. So I absolutely was 20 years ago one of those that would say the more engagement, the more opportunity, the more dialogue we have, the more China will see. Got that wrong. Now, got that wrong partly because of what China gets to see. We're not engaging with the democracy. We're certainly not engaging with a liberal democracy. We're engaging with a very controlling system. I mean, part of the reason why, you have got 70% of people, 75% of people in Russia that think that Putin's right about Ukraine is because they can't see anything different. And 100 years ago, in a different way, in a different place, but without digital, exactly the same techniques were used. You can't have a conversation if you can't see what's actually going on, or different perspectives, or different points of view. So it's actually very difficult. But I think that in a way, and this takes me back to the day job, some of our best interlocutors right now potentially might be business and might be the private sector, where government interlocutors are rather stuck in a East versus West, to use an old analogy, but certainly stuck in a we're liberal democracies and you're not. The corporate sector and the business sector, which is where I hang out most of the time, can actually continue a dialogue and decide where to invest. Yeah. So let me take the example of what's happened recently in Singapore. Yeah. Now, so I'm not in any way comparing Singapore to China, but on LGBTQ rights, for many years, it's absolutely not been safe to be me in Singapore, to be able to be yourself. And a lot of Western businesses became increasingly clear with the Singaporean government that unless they changed some of their laws, they were going to vote with their feet and start to locate and invest elsewhere. You are seeing similar sorts of noises from some major brands now, not those that are directly associated with the World Cup, but around some of the debates, people are asking me, businesses are asking me, what should they do about Qatar? People haven't asked me that. People have never asked me that before. So I think there's a window into this in a way. But no, I mean, have we got our approach right to this in the past 20, 30 years? As have governments got their approach right to this? Well, evidently not.
But Iain, I would respectfully, that's the new word, respectfully disagree, because it seems to me Singapore has benefited hugely from what China's been doing in Hong Kong, and that's been more important for investment than anything else. And the other thing is, in the US, we've seen this backlash against companies that have been involved in civil rights, in helping their employees, whether it's in abortion or whether it's ESG investing. And there's been a backlash against them. So, and a number of people saying, what are you companies doing, getting involved in what we see as a non-business aspect? So actually, Trevor, would you pick up that view as to, are things changing in the corporate sector, or actually are we going back to business, stick to business?
No, I mean, I agree with Iain quite a bit on this. I think that the norms in the corporate sector are changing, and partly because you've got a different generation of businesses. It is also, by the way, worth saying, we may come back to this, that within most big corporates, there is, if you like, a kind of cultural battle going on. And I'm going to put this in the most crass way, crude way possibly, about who's really in charge. Are the grown-ups in charge, or are the kids in charge? And this comes out rather forcibly on questions to do with sexual identity and so on, and also, for example, how one approached Black Lives Matter and all of that. So I think that there is a sort of change of sentiment within the corporate sector. However, having said all of that, in the end, I chair a couple of companies, and our business, we're fortunate that we have shareholders who go with our mission. That's largely because that's us, and we are mission driven. So nobody tells us what to do. But if we were to trade, let's say, in China, we would have to deal with the reality. I've got a great friend who was a minister of religion in Jamaica. His journalist went on a trip to Shanghai, came back enthusing about what the Chinese are doing. His father said, yeah, they are building, these great new cities and all that, and shiny and glass, and they're lifting people out of poverty, but they can't practice their religion. And the son said, yeah, you know what? It would be good if people have the roof over their heads. Then we can teach them to pray. And China, which is spending, I think, 400 billion a year on Belt and Road Initiative, is buying friends across the world who say, yeah, we understand that President Xi is creating a state which is the antithesis of a democratic state. But you know what? He's feeding his people. So I think, Karina, the point you made is an extremely strong one, that in the I don't use this word lightly, the struggle across the globe today, the struggle of ideas is probably the most important one. And I would say, if I'm honest, that we are in the West losing that struggle of ideas because we look a bit chaotic. Our leaders are a bit gerontocratic or get chucked out every 10 minutes. And most of all, there is a sense in which our class, the political class, tends to spend a lot of time explaining to itself and to everybody else what a bunch of racist, big imperialist bigots we are. And then we wonder why Putin and Xi and their people view us with contempt. Well, good reason, because we're telling them that we're not worth much.
Actually, let me pick up on that because, to inject a note of positivity here, I mean, I think the UK is in a reasonably good position. We have a diverse cabinet, a British-born Asian as Prime Minister, and Trevor Noah, the comedian, did some ridiculous show saying there had been a backlash against him. Well, there hadn't been a backlash against him. And that is exactly what I felt so proud that there wasn't. And yes, there are conversations, but the conversations, because, for example, one of the conversations that is quite bothersome is around slavery and colonialism. I mean, surely, Iain, there is a sensible, inclusive way of dealing with it and stopping it from being all the noise in the room.
There is. Sorry. I mean, briefly back to the Trevor Noah point. I mean, look, this is clickbait. It's kind of, the way the New York Times as well wants to describe the UK, it's clickbait. It's all it's doing. I mean, let's be absolutely honest. It's about the money. It's no more complicated than that. It's just about adding people that are going to read that stuff or view that show. It's no more complicated. But it's a business model. On the point about interpreting and understanding our history, I am absolutely not into pulling things down. I'm into contextualizing them. Yeah. So while I've been in Washington, I came in at the weekend, and the first thing I did, because I'd not seen it before, it's pretty new. Some on the call may have been when they've been in the States, but I went to the Smithsonian, I think the newest part of the Smithsonian, which is the American Black History and Culture Museum, because I wanted to kind of find out about stuff. And you find out warts and all. You find out about the struggle for civil rights, but you also find out about the enormous contribution to American sport, to American history, to American literature, to America. And for me, there's as a Scot, there's a huge amount of astouche, as we would say in Scotland, about what to do about Henry Dundas, a very famous Scottish-British politician, very big monument, classic Georgian monument in the middle of Edinburgh. And of course, everyone's piled in. Pull it down, build it higher. For me, keep it up there, but contextualize it. Contextualize it. Give people some more history. Give people some more understanding. Create some more dialogue. Don't put this stuff in the bin. It happened. We can't uninvent it. So for me, that's the way you deal with this. You don't ignore the elephant. You
label the elephant.
You walk towards the elephant, however tall or small it is.
Trevor, I mean, do you agree? Is that a way forward?
I will not waste your time by repeating what Iain said. I couldn't put it any more eloquently. I completely agree. By the way, you will know Jeff Palmer, who is is an old family friend of ours, and I've just always said what the approach that you've set out is exactly the right one. And just very quickly on the Trevor Noah thing, it's right to say, you're right, it's clickbait and all that, but here's the important thing in my mind. The Trevor Noah audience laughed. He knew who his audience was. And that audience is, put it bluntly, a white, liberal, well-off, graduate, influential American audience, which likes the narrative of Britain being a bit backward, a bit quaint, certainly quite racist. And we know, the royal story that has been playing out in California has been for that class. It doesn't correspond to anything that anybody in this country really experiences. So it comes back to my point earlier on that there is an issue about the way we allow ourselves to be portrayed. And I think your point, Karina, which is about essentially our image being used as part of a more global battle about our values. And to throw one other point in, we see what's happening in Iran, and it's so evident what those incredibly courageous and inventive women are doing, but they are faced with the might of a government machine, not just military and policing, but ideological, which essentially is telling Iranian people a story which a lot of Iranian people would like to believe, which is that these young women are allied with the West. And you know what happens in the West? We allow our daughters to do things like choose their own husbands. That's, in their eyes, a decadent society. And I completely agree that there is an issue about the kind of information that is available to people in those countries. But I don't think, in the end, that's the only point here, or even the most important point. I think the real point is that there is an argument coming about what is the right and the best way for human beings to live. And we have to demonstrate that the way that we want to live, which is a liberal democracy, open-minded, is better and delivers better human results than what is happening, for example, in China.
I mean, I would love to we should stop the broadcast there, because that was lovely, lovely last lines, Trevor, really good. However, there's one issue I want to do before we go to questions, and it's one that it's really divided people, and it's trans rights. And again, an issue that shouldn't divide people. Can we not have a conversation about this rather than a shouting match and ostracizing people and cancelling them? Iain?
Yeah, I mean, this for me is again where the megaphone has just gone just off the dial. It's just again, many on this call will remember, as sadly past now, quite a iconic figure in British latter 20th century life, Jan Morris. I don't know if anybody remembers Jan Morris, but so there was Jan, a explorer who went off to Everest, I think, with Edmund Hillary, who then transitioned, became an incredibly successful writer and broadcaster. And as I was growing up in the backdrop of Section 28 in the UK, that was a piece of legislation which actually is the reason why Stonewall was born, in order to campaign against that piece of legislation, which didn't allow teachers to actually allow people, back to where we were earlier, build personal resilience by understanding and educating how they could be themselves as an LGBTQ person. But everybody I knew, the entire national discourse was very comfortable and very relaxed and very accepting and very celebrating of Jan Morris. And you know, I think sadly what's gone on here and what is going on here is layered through our conversation, which is, you know, extremes on either end of this have latched on to the trans issue in order to try and either push back against LGBTQ rights or push back in another direction. And you know, it's part of the reason why I stepped back from that role you mentioned earlier, Karina, because the UK government decided that it would not do what it said it was going to do, which is the reason I took the job to be the first ever LGBTQ business champion, by taking the T off LGBT on the commitment that the government has made around banning conversion therapy in the UK. And it was very clear to me why, because they thought there was some polling that demonstrated that you could create a wedge issue here, because as again we've seen in the United States, and you see some of the stuff that comes out of Ron DeSantis, you know, this is regarded as good politics. Well, it's not good politics. But all the polling demonstrates that it's overwhelmingly bad politics, and it's you know, it's about debating people's lives rather than making people's lives better. So no, I mean, something has gone badly wrong here. It's part of the reason why I've taken up. I'm not in the Stonewall chair yet. I'm in the Stonewall chair later this month formally, and I want to try and change the nature of all of this, all of this shouting match.
I think we've got an amazing question, which I think, given how little time we have, I'm going to put to both of you. Alex Smith, LSE student from Newcastle. What do you think would be the one change of policy which would have the biggest impact? What do you think would be the one change of policy which would have the biggest impact? Trevor, would you take that first?
Well, I wonder if you could just maybe infer biggest impact on what?
Since he's not, he's just online, I think you're going to have to assume biggest impact on what? Keeping our society pluralistic, keeping the world pluralistic.
Okay.
Take it any way you want.
Okay, well, I would say that, first of all, can I just say how incredibly delighted I am to hear the tone in which Iain answered your last question, because it's a complete contrast to, I think, a lot of what's been said and the way it's been said from all quarters in the last couple of years, where, you know, people say things like no debate and all of that. It's just toxic. Now, it may be that Iain and I might not agree about the question, or even what the central question is, but I do feel if we were to follow his prescription, at least we could have a conversation about it without talking as though the other person were evil and badly motivated. I've got some, there are some technical things I would have said about the trans rights thing. I mean, just from the point of view, there is no such thing as trans rights any more than there are black rights. There are human rights that apply to all sorts of people and are more meaningful for some groups of people than for other groups of people. But if we start from the point of view that there's some people who've got this specific right and there's some people over there who've got that specific right and they've got to go to war, we've already lost. So I do think, but I do really welcome the way in which Iain answered it. And in a way, that's the answer to the questioner. Most of politics is not really about what is right and what is wrong. If it was clear what is right and what is wrong, we would not need politics. We just do, most of us, the right thing. Most of politics and most of public policy is generally about a choice. And the choice is usually between bad and worse options. That's why we need politics. But in order to, first of all, identify what the options are, and then to have a proper conversation about what is bad and what is worse, we need to be civil, we need to be generous, we need to be open, and we need to accept that the fact that somebody may not see things the way we do is a product of their experience, it's a product of the particular aspirations and ambitions that they have, and they may want to choose differently. That doesn't make them a bad person. And if we could just all agree with that, then we could get somewhere.
Thank you, Trevor. And Iain, your last words about, what would be the one change of policy which would have the biggest impact? Take that question any way you'd like.
Well, look, I'm not the kind of person that reaches for government intervention on everything. But I think we've teased out quite a lot in this conversation, Karina, which is, we talk about resilience. We've talked about how people can get access to real information as opposed to propaganda. We've talked about, as just Trevor was saying, a more respectful conversation, which is something that I'm absolutely into, and not into a shouting and screaming match. So if we're really wanting to pull the policy handle, it maybe is education, and when people's worldviews, when people's opportunities are forming, or those opportunities actually are not forming for so many people, that it's at that point where policy can make a difference. It's essentially about great education, about free speech, about an inquiring mind, about the ability to see the path in life that you can take, and allowing people to actually be able to choose a path. So I think I said it up front, which is, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes we don't also talk about the necessary piece around social mobility at the same time. And I think that, for me, is where policy needs to lock together. I think we did some of this stuff better a few years ago than we do it now as a result of digital. But for me, it's the education lever I would pull.
Thank you both. Absolutely fascinating. And it's about the tone, isn't it? It's about keeping a respectful tone. I was listening to Stevie Wonder yesterday morning, and he has got the best line. I'm going to quote it, and I think it's a good way to end. His song is, "Try to see it my way. We can work it out." And actually, that's all we need to do. See it somebody else's way, respect it. One doesn't have to agree, but in the end, we can work it out. So thank you both, Iain Anderson, Trevor Phillips. Thank you for a fascinating conversation. We could have gone on for rather a lot longer, but I know that Trevor's got other things to do and Iain's got a train to Washington. So thank you both, and goodbye from the Inclusion Initiative at the London School of Economics.